Hey guys, continuing Iamblichus' Exhortation to Philosophy, chapter 13. In this chapter, Iamblichus says, we will now motivate ourselves to study philosophy by looking at some philosophical concepts. So in every chapter, as we remember, he uses different ways to exhort us, to motivate us, to not just study, but a life of philosophy. Here is the first philosophical concept. He says, philosophy is the study of death. Essentially, we study how to die, how to be dead, and what kind of death we deserve. This is the idea that he introduces. And he says, what exactly is death? Death is a separation of the soul from the body. That's what happens in the moment of death. And he says philosopher's goal is exactly that, to separate the soul as much as possible from the body. And we're starting to remember now the previous chapters. The Theranian, or whatever the name for that torture was, where Iamblichus explained a method of torture used where to a prisoner a dead body was bound, so that a prisoner constantly moved, and the only thing he could see really in front of him was another man's dead body as it was rotting away. And Iamblichus made an analogy to the soul and the body, that the soul is bound to the body in a similar way, like in a prison. So our goal, philosopher's goal, is to free up the soul from the body. And we're starting to, if we practice philosophy, if we don't just read it, if we do meditations, if we do spiritual exercises and so forth, we're starting to understand what is meant by this, by all of this. We're starting to understand that through practices and through the study of philosophy, our mind turns upwards towards the higher concepts. And we start to experience joy and pleasure in them. We start to experience more peace through, because our mind is turned upwards and not downwards. And as I understand it, that starts to free up the soul from its binding to the body. And Iamblichus here says that when other people look at philosophers, when the mundane, typical person looks at a philosopher, they think the philosopher's life is so bad it's not worth living, because the philosopher is not enjoying is not having any pleasure, because he's not enjoying any of the things. He's not surrounding himself by physical things. If we look at some philosophers, they lived very humble lives. They didn't have much money. They didn't buy expensive things, and so forth. So when a mundane person looks at a person like that, all they see is lack. Naturally, they think, poor man, this man's life is very unhappy. Because this is what the mundane person sees. They do not understand that the philosopher is deriving pleasure not from physical things, but from contemplations, from the use of the mind. And so a philosopher could be much happier than a billionaire who is next to him, who has all things. And we see this in research with Buddhism and Buddhist monks, because Buddhist monks normally very free and generous with themselves to the psychological community, to the scientific communities. So a lot of psychologists, scientists study what happens with Buddhist monks. And what do we see? We see that a monk might have nothing at all and have incredibly high levels of happiness in terms of their hormone levels, their body, and their health, and could be walking around in ecstasy. And if we compare him to another person who is extremely rich, has everything, all the physical things that one might desire, but is really unhappy, that makes no sense from a mundane perspective. But we understand what is happening. The monk is getting higher pleasures, much more powerful pleasures from the higher world. So this is a really nice this part of this chapter. I really like it. Now let's do a mini meditation and see if any ideas arise during this meditation about this. And if anything pops up in my head, I will share it. If anything pops up in your head, please also share it in the comments below. That's it. Let's do a mini meditation. Just relax and meditate. Okay. So how does this happen? That the philosopher is studying how to die. What is he doing? Remember from previous chapters, it is constant self-control of base desires, not giving free rein to our physical desires, but gaining more and more control over them and subjecting them to reason, making the body become a servant of the soul and reason. So in a way, you are not really engaging in the physical world, so to say, at least in terms of the senses. And essentially a lot of your time, for example, you, at least at the beginning, as I understand it, you spent in the meditations and practices, the whole point of which is to withdraw from constant sensory stimulation of your body. The more and more you withdraw from that through meditations and so forth, the more your mind frees up, and the more you start to grasp and have realizations, intuitions, and develop essentially your reasoning in this way. So there is a phrase in this chapter that goes, who knows if to live is to be dead, or to be dead is to live. It's a very interesting part. I think, I don't have a separate video on this phrase. I just remembered it. The way I understand it is to enjoy more and more life, we kind of have to die in it. And by that, we have to develop, what I understand is we have to develop willpower over our base desires and our thoughts over everything. Subject everything to will, so it is then used for the development of reason, and used in a virtuous way. Essentially, we become dead in the physical world because we're turning off our senses from all this stimulation, or from enjoyment of this stimulation. We're cutting off all these attachments. We're literally dying, as I understand it. And the result of that, our mind turns upwards. It's more and more freed from the body. And we start to experience more and more pleasure and happiness and joy and peace from within. So it no longer matters to us where we are in the physical world or what are we doing. We still experience high levels of peace and happiness. It's coming from within because we withdrew that energy from the outer world, and through within we went higher up, and now that channel is created, and from that channel we are deriving pleasure, peace, happiness, joy, ecstatic states, and so forth. So we had to die, in a way, in the physical world to become alive. And naturally that brings more physical health, because we're in extremely calm and peaceful states. Psychological health, energy and vitality. And we see all those things in monks who practice spirituality of whichever religion. We see these things in them. Much higher levels of psychological health, physical health, than in a typical average person who doesn't practice religious or philosophical exercises, meditations, and so forth. So that's to die is to live. And to live is to die. That part of the phrase, I understand it as, if we fully give in to our base desires, pretty quickly we will die. And we see this with drug addicts, we see this with sex addicts. The person's energy starts to just disappear very quickly, and they start to get more and more ill. Kidneys start to go, and so forth. The more we give in to our base desires, fully give in to whichever pleasures we can get from the physical world, without control of reason, without questioning, is this virtuous? Without questioning, is this viceful, this behavior? If we just completely freely give in, if we fully live in that way, pretty quickly we die. That's how I understand it. So it's a very nice phrase. I forgot who said it, but Iamblichus, I think in this chapter, Iamblichus gives it. The quote, who knows if to live is to be dead, or to be dead is to live. That two-part phrase. So that's it, guys. We can see how a philosopher is completely misunderstood by the public now, how the public sees him as essentially a loser, because typically a philosopher will have nothing in life in terms of necessities and physical things, because those things are worthless to him, meaningless, and obstructive to his goal, which is to prepare himself for this moment, so that when this moment comes, it is the right kind of moment. And the philosopher then soars into the highest and highest states of existence. That's it. Thank you, guys, for your time. A video will now appear. You can click on it and continue watching this channel. Bye bye.